He invited his ex-wife to a family dinner to humiliate her in front of everyone who mattered, but she walked in with a billionaire on her arm and taught him the most expensive lesson of his life. Hi, my empowered queens and kings. Welcome home to stories that rise from the ashes. If no one has lifted you up today, let me be the voice that does. You are unbreakable. You are worthy. You are fiercely, fiercely loved. I don't speak to masses. I speak to warriors. Your warrior spirit. And if my fire still burns in yours, please comment, I am rising. And like this story, not because I asked, but because it ignites something real in you. When you do that on your own, I feel so alive. I feel honored. I feel connected. You are the heartbeat of these tales. Every time I craft one, I think of you. Your resilience, your grace, your unyielding strength. I don't just narrate journeys. I forge them with the belief I have in you, and I swear no one on this earth could ever champion you the way I do. Now accept this blessing from me like armor for the battles ahead. May your scars become your crown, your pain fuel your empire, and your heart reclaim every stolen piece. May your ambitions soar unchecked. Your loved ones shield you with truth, and your victories silence every doubt. May every betrayal bloom into your greatest triumph. And may empowerment, true empowerment, embrace you from every angle, every single day. Let's ignite. Step by step, strength by strength. One empire, one love, unbreakable. The ivory envelope trembled in Regina Hawking's hands as she stared at the embossed letterhead that would change everything. After 3 years of freedom from James Lewis, 3 years of rebuilding herself from the wreckage of their marriage, he was reaching out again. Not with an apology, not with remorse, but with an invitation to a family dinner, a thinly veiled trap designed to remind her of everything she'd supposedly lost. Her heart didn't race with anxiety anymore, though. That woman who used to shake at the sound of his voice was gone. She'd cremated that version of herself in the fires of entrepreneurship, rebuilt her confidence brick by brick through her thriving business empire, and discovered what real love felt like in the arms of Mark Fraley. At 32, Regina knew her worth now. She knew the difference between a man who controlled and a man who cherished. Regina glanced at the invitation one more time, running her fingers over James's carefully chosen words. A family gathering to celebrate new beginnings. The arrogance was breathtaking. He actually believed she would walk in defeated, crawling back to witness his happiness, hungry for the scraps of the life she'd escaped. A slow smile spread across her face as she reached for her phone. "Mark," she said when her partner answered, his voice warm and steady like it always was. "Remember that ex-husband I told you about? The one who spent 5 years convincing me I wasn't good enough?" She paused, feeling the power in her next words. "He wants to see me again. And I think it's time I showed him exactly who Regina Hawking became after he threw her away." At 39, Mark Fraley had built his billion-dollar empire on reading people and calculated risks. Regina could hear the smile in his voice when he responded, "When do we leave? Not if. Not are you sure. Just unwavering support. The kind James had never offered, even on his best day." The day of the dinner arrived draped in October twilight. Regina stood before her full-length mirror in a stunning designer gown, midnight blue silk that hugged every curve she'd learned to love about herself. The kind of dress that cost more than James used to say she was worth. Her reflection showed a woman transformed. Not broken, not bitter, just beautifully, powerfully, free. But as she fastened diamond earrings Mark had given her for her last birthday, memories flickered like old film reels. James's voice echoing through their former penthouse. "You'll never amount to anything without me." His cruel laughter when she suggested starting her own business. The way he'd flaunted his affairs, confident she had nowhere else to go. The final, devastating day when he'd packed his bags and walked out, leaving her crumpled on the floor of the life they'd built together. "You're thinking about him again." Mark's voice pulled her back to the present. He stood in the doorway of her bedroom, devastatingly handsome in a tailored charcoal suit, his presence radiating the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing to prove. He crossed to her, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "You don't have to do this, Regina. You don't owe him anything, not even the satisfaction of seeing how well you've done. Regina turned to face him, placing her palm against his chest where she could feel his heartbeat, steady and sure. I'm not doing this for him, Mark. I'm doing this for the woman I used to be, the one who believed his lies. She deserves to see what happened after she finally chose herself. The drive to James Lewis's estate took 40 minutes through the affluent suburbs where old money built monuments to itself. Regina remembered this route. She'd traveled it hundreds of times during their marriage, always feeling like an imposter in these neighborhoods, always hearing James's voice reminding her she came from the wrong side of everything that mattered. But tonight, as Mark's Mercedes glided through the tree-lined streets, Regina felt nothing but calm certainty. Her business was thriving, 3 locations, 50 employees, and a waiting list of clients that stretched months into the future. She'd built something real, something that belonged entirely to her. More importantly, she'd built herself into someone who knew that wealth wasn't measured only in bank accounts but in self-respect, in chosen family, in the ability to look in the mirror and love what she saw. James's mansion loomed ahead, every window blazing with light like a stage set for the performance he'd orchestrated. Regina could already picture him inside, smugly anticipating her arrival, convinced she would walk in alone, diminished, desperate for some acknowledgement that she'd once mattered to him. "Ready?" Mark asked, his hand finding hers in the darkness of the car. Regina squeezed back, feeling the weight of her engagement ring. Mark's proposal had come 3 months ago on a beach in Santorini, nothing like the cold transaction James had made of their marriage. "I've been ready for 3 years," she said. "He just doesn't know it yet." They stepped out of the car together, and Regina felt the October air kiss her skin like a benediction. Mark offered his arm, and she took it, not because she needed support, but because real partnership meant choosing to walk side by side. Her heels clicked against the marble walkway leading to James's front door, each step a declaration, each breath a victory over the woman she used to be. The door opened before they could knock. James's mother, Eleanor Lewis, stood in the entrance, her expression freezing mid-welcome as she registered not just Regina's presence, but her transformation. The expensive gown, the confidence radiating from every pore, the extraordinarily handsome man at her side whose tailored suit and quiet authority screamed old money and new power. "Regina?" Eleanor's voice cracked slightly, her practiced social graces momentarily deserting her. We didn't expect." "Expect what, Eleanor?" Regina's smile was gracious but held an edge sharp enough to cut. "That I'd decline? That I'd arrive broken? Or that I'd come alone?" She gestured to Mark. "This is Mark Fraley, my fiancé. Mark, this is Eleanor Lewis. We have so much history together." The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown. From somewhere deep in the house, Regina heard the clatter of silverware hitting fine china. James had heard her voice. And in that moment, Regina knew with absolute certainty. The lesson she'd come to teach was about to begin. 3 weeks earlier, the envelope had arrived on a Tuesday morning when Regina was least expecting to be thrown back into her past. She'd been reviewing quarterly reports in her home office, sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city she'd conquered, one client at a time, when her assistant Sophia brought in the mail. The cream-colored envelope sat on top of the stack, elegant and expensive, James Lewis's family crest embossed in gold on the back flap. Regina's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. "Everything all right?" Sophia asked, noticing the shift in her boss's expression. Regina forced a smile. "Just ghosts knocking on doors I thought I'd locked forever." She waited until Sophia left before opening it. Her fingers steady despite the acceleration of her heartbeat. The invitation was exactly what she'd expected. Pretentious, formal, dripping with the kind of old money superiority James had always wielded like a weapon. "Mr. James Edward Lewis III requests the honor of your presence at a family dinner celebrating new beginnings." No personal note, no acknowledgement of their history, just a cold, calculated summons delivered with the assumption that she would come running. Regina read it 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of his arrogance. The date was circled in gold ink, the dress code listed as formal elegance. The venue was his family estate. The same mansion, where his mother had once told Regina she would never truly belong, where dinner conversations had centered on country clubs and boarding schools Regina had never attended, where she'd spent 5 years feeling like an imposter at someone else's table. Her first instinct was to tear it up, feed it to her shredder, and watch James's presumption turn to confetti. She'd spent 3 years building a life where men like him held no power over her emotions, where his opinion mattered exactly as much as yesterday's weather forecast. Why would she willingly walk back into his world, even for one evening? But as she stared at the invitation, something else stirred beneath her initial anger. A small, fierce voice that had been silent during her marriage, but had grown stronger with every success she'd built, every boundary she'd learned to set, every morning she'd woken up and chosen herself. "This is an opportunity," the voice whispered, "not to prove anything to him, but to close this chapter for yourself." Regina picked up her phone and called Mark. He answered on the second ring, his voice carrying that warmth that still made her heart skip even after 2 years together. "Tell me you're calling because you miss me, and not because something's wrong." "Both, actually." Regina found herself smiling despite the turmoil churning in her chest. "James invited me to a family dinner." Well, invited is generous. It's more like a royal summons with a return address. The pause on Mark's end was brief but meaningful. "Do you want to go?" Not "should you." She noticed. Want. He always started with her desires, her agency, her choice. "I don't know yet," Regina admitted, standing to pace her office, the invitation still clutched in her hand. "Part of me thinks it's a trap. James doesn't do anything without an agenda. He wants something from this, and my gut tells me it's not closure or friendship." "Then what is it?" Mark's voice was gentle, encouraging her to work through her thoughts aloud. Regina stopped at her window, looking out at the skyline. "Control. He wants to see me again so he can remind himself that he was the one who left, that he had the power in our relationship. Men like James need to feel superior, and I think 3 years of silence has been eating at him. He probably assumes I'm struggling, barely surviving without him." She laughed, the sound bitter but genuine. "He has no idea what I've built." "And he has no idea who you've become," Mark added. "Regina, if you want to decline, I support that completely. You don't owe him anything, not your presence, not your time, not even a response. But if some part of you wants to go, to face him one more time, I'll be right there beside you." That promise settled something deep in Regina's chest. During her marriage to James, she'd faced every challenge alone. Every family gathering where his relatives looked down on her. Every business dinner where he'd positioned her as arm candy rather than an equal. Every crisis where he'd been physically present but emotionally absent. Mark was offering something different. Partnership. Actual support. The kind of presence that didn't diminish her strength but amplified it. "I think I want to go," Regina heard herself say, surprising even herself with the certainty in her voice. "Not because he deserves to see me, but because I deserve to walk into that house one more time as the woman I am now, not the woman he tried to keep me as." Over the next 2 weeks, as Regina prepared for the dinner, she found herself thinking more about her own journey than about James. Mark watched her carefully, attuned to the subtle shifts in her mood, ready to provide space when she needed to process, and closeness when she needed comfort. One evening, as they sat on her apartment balcony watching the sun set over the city, Regina turned to him with a question she'd been wrestling with. "Do you think I'm doing this for revenge? Because if I am, I'm not sure that's who I want to be." Mark considered this, his hand finding hers in the gathering darkness. "I think revenge would be going there to hurt him, to make him feel small. But from everything you've told me, that's not why you're going. You're going to prove something to yourself that you can walk into that house and walk out again still intact. Still you. That's not revenge, that's liberation." His words settled something that had been restless inside her. Yes, liberation. That's what this was about. For 5 years, James had defined her worth by his standards. For 3 years of freedom, she'd been rebuilding herself according to her own values. This dinner would be the final test. Could she stand in his presence without shrinking, without questioning herself, without needing his approval or fearing his judgment? The night before the dinner, Regina laid out her chosen dress, the midnight blue silk that made her feel powerful and beautiful. Mark had offered to stay over, but she'd asked for the evening alone. She needed to sit with the younger version of herself, the woman who'd believe James when he said she wasn't enough, and have one final conversation. "I'm so sorry he convinced you to doubt yourself," Regina whispered to her reflection, to the ghost of who she'd been. "But look at what you built from those doubts. Look at what you became when you finally stopped believing his lies." Tomorrow, she would walk into James Lewis's world one final time, but she would walk in on her own terms, with a man who cherished her beside her, carrying the confidence of someone who'd already won simply by choosing to save herself. The morning light filtered through Regina's bedroom curtains with an almost mocking gentleness, as if the universe didn't understand the weight of what this day represented. She stood before her full-length mirror, the midnight blue gown already draped across her bed like a promise waiting to be kept. But she wasn't ready to put it on yet. First, she needed to face the woman staring back at her in simple silk pajamas, the woman who carried scars that had healed into strength. Regina's fingers traced the edge of her vanity, landing on a small velvet box she kept tucked behind her perfume bottles. Inside was her old wedding ring, the one she'd removed 3 years ago with shaking hands and tear-stained cheeks. She opened it now with steady fingers, studying the diamond that had once represented everything she thought she wanted. "You're lucky I even looked at you twice." James's voice echoed from the past, unbidden but no longer able to wound. She'd been 23 when he'd said those words, standing in the kitchen of their first apartment after she'd suggested applying to graduate school. He'd laughed. That particular laugh that always made her feel small, and told her she should focus on being a proper wife instead of chasing dreams she'd never achieve. The memory shifted, flickering like old film reels. Their second anniversary dinner at Le Bernardin. She'd worn a dress she'd saved for months to afford, excited to celebrate their love. But James had spent the entire evening on his phone, texting someone named Nicole. When Regina had gently asked if everything was okay, he'd snapped at her for being clingy and insecure. "This is why you don't have friends, Regina. You're exhausting." She'd believed him then. God, she'd actually believed every cruel word that fell from his mouth. Another memory surfaced, sharper and more painful. The night she'd discovered the affair. Not Nicole, as it turned out. That had been earlier. This was Stephanie, a colleague from his firm. Regina had found the hotel receipt in his suit pocket while gathering dry cleaning. When she'd confronted him, trembling with a combination of rage and heartbreak, James hadn't even bothered to deny it. "What did you expect? You stopped trying years ago." Stephanie actually takes care of herself. Regina had looked down at her body then, the body that had gained 15 pounds from stress and depression, and felt shame wash over her like acid. She'd spent the rest of that night locked in the bathroom, crying so quietly she wouldn't disturb him, believing she was the problem, believing she deserved his cruelty. "Regina." Mark's voice pulled her back to the present like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning. She blinked, realizing tears had tracked silently down her cheeks. She hadn't even felt them fall. He stood in the doorway of her bedroom, concern etched across his features. They'd exchanged keys 6 months ago, but he always announced himself, always respected her space in ways James never had. "I knocked, but you didn't answer. I got worried." Regina closed the velvet box with a soft click, tucking away the past where it belonged. "I'm okay. Just taking a trip down memory lane. Not the scenic route, unfortunately." Mark crossed the room, his movements unhurried, giving her time to refuse his comfort if she needed solitude instead. But Regina found herself leaning into him when he wrapped his arms around her, his presence solid and warm and real. "Tell me," he said softly, his chin resting on top of her head. So she did. The words tumbled out. 3 years of stored pain that she'd processed alone, rebuilt from, but never fully voiced to someone who would listen without judgment. She told him about the constant criticism, the way James had systematically dismantled her confidence piece by piece, the affairs he'd flaunted, the family gatherings where his mother had made pointed comments about breeding and proper upbringing, while James smiled and said nothing in her defense. She told him about the final day, When James had packed his bags and announced he was leaving her for his newest girlfriend, a woman from his social circle who actually understood his world. How he'd looked at Regina with such cold indifference, as if their 5 years together had meant absolutely nothing. He said I was the biggest mistake he'd ever made, Regina whispered, the memory still capable of causing a dull ache even though the sharp edges had worn smooth. He said I'd never be anything without him, that I'd spend the rest of my life regretting that I'd let someone like him slip away. Mark was quiet for a long moment, his hand moving in soothing circles along her back. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an edge of barely controlled anger. I'm trying very hard not to say what I want to say about him right now, because this is your moment and your story. But Regina, I need you to know something. He gently turned her to face him, his hands cupping her face with infinite tenderness. Everything he said to you was a lie. Every single word. You know that now, right? You built an empire from nothing. You created a life that's authentic and successful and beautiful, and you did it all without him. Actually, you did it despite him. Regina nodded, fresh tears falling, but these were different. These were the tears that came from being truly seen, truly valued. I know, I do know. But sometimes, in quiet moments like this morning, his voice still creeps in. It whispers that I'm not good enough, that tonight is a mistake, that walking back into his world will somehow give him power over me again. Look at me, Mark said firmly, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. He only has the power you give him. And the woman standing in front of me right now, she doesn't give her power away anymore. She knows exactly what she's worth. Regina took a shaky breath, letting his words anchor her back to the truth she'd built her new life upon. She wasn't the broken 26-year-old who'd watched James walk out the door. She was Regina Hawking, entrepreneur, survivor. A woman who'd taken every cruel word and transformed them into fuel for her success. You're right, she said, her voice growing steadier. I'm not going tonight to prove anything to him. I'm going to prove something to myself, that I can stand in the same room with him and not feel diminished. That his opinion of me doesn't matter anymore because I've built my own definition of success. Mark smiled, pride evident in his expression. There she is. There's my fierce, unstoppable Regina. She turned back to the mirror, this time seeing herself clearly, not through James's eyes, not through the lens of who she used to be, but as she actually was, strong, successful, worthy of real love. Regina reached for her gown, the silk whispering against her skin as she prepared to step into it. Tonight, she would walk into James Lewis's home one final time. But she would walk in as herself, completely and unapologetically. And that, she realized, was the greatest revenge of all. The chandelier light hit them first, casting Regina and Mark in a golden glow as they stepped through the double doors of James Lewis's dining room. Everything stopped. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Crystal glasses froze halfway to lips. Even the servers stationed along the walls seemed to pause their choreographed movements, caught in the gravity of the moment. Regina felt the weight of every eye in the room. But instead of shrinking beneath their scrutiny, she stood taller. The midnight blue silk of her gown caught the light with every breath, transforming her into something luminous and untouchable. Mark's hand rested gently at the small of her back, not possessive, not controlling, just present. At the head of the mahogany table, James Lewis sat in his throne-like chair, his expression carefully arranged into smug satisfaction. He'd staged this moment perfectly. The opulent setting, his family arranged like an audience, the empty chair positioned where Regina would have maximum visibility of everything she'd supposedly lost. Regina, James's voice carried across the room with practiced condescension. I'm so glad you could make it. I wasn't sure you'd have the courage to show your face here again. He gestured expansively at the room, at his assembled relatives, at the lavish spread of food that probably cost more than Regina used to make in a month. Please, sit. I saved you a special seat. The chair he indicated was positioned far from the head of the table, tucked between his elderly aunt and a cousin, Regina, vaguely remembered from awkward holiday gatherings. A power move, designed to physically diminish her importance. Regina smiled, the expression serene and knowing. How thoughtful, James. But I think we'll sit here instead. She gestured to two empty chairs near the center of the table. Prime real estate that James clearly hadn't anticipated needing to accommodate her plus one. James's smugness flickered. Just for a moment. His eyes finally tracked to the man standing beside Regina, and something shifted in his expression. Mark Fraley wasn't just handsome, though the way he wore his tailored suit suggested a man comfortable in his own skin. It was the quiet authority he projected, the way he moved through space like someone who'd never questioned his right to be anywhere. James Lewis. Mark extended his hand as they approached, his voice warm and respectful. Mark Fraley. I've heard quite a bit about you. The statement hung in the air, deliberately ambiguous. Had Mark heard good things? Bad things? His pleasant expression gave nothing away, but the faintest hint of amusement in his eyes suggested he knew exactly what game James was playing. James stood slowly, his height advantage usually intimidating, but somehow Mark matched him eye to eye with none of the aggressive posturing. The handshake was firm, professional, the kind exchanged between equals. James clearly wanted to make it a contest, but Mark's grip was neither submissive nor domineering, just confident. Fraley, James repeated, his mind clearly racing to place the name. Are you in finance? Among other things. Mark's smile never wavered. Real estate development, tech investments, a few hospitality ventures. Regina and I actually met at a conference about sustainable urban planning. She was the keynote speaker. The words landed like carefully placed bombs. Regina, a keynote speaker. Regina, important enough to share a stage with people Mark networking with. Regina, existing in professional circles James clearly hadn't imagined her accessing. Keynote speaker. James's mother, Eleanor, spoke from her position 3 seats down, her voice carrying that particular tone wealthy women used when confronted with information that didn't align with their assumptions. Regina, I didn't realize you'd become so involved in professional matters. Regina settled into her chair with fluid grace, Mark pulling it out for her before taking his own seat. The business has grown beyond my expectations, Eleanor. 3 locations now, 50 employees, and we just secured a contract with the city for a major redevelopment project in the financial district. She delivered the information casually, as if discussing the weather rather than outlining her considerable success. But every person at that table understood the subtext. Regina Hawking, the woman James had discarded as unworthy, had built an empire while he'd been busy congratulating himself on his escape. James's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. How nice for you, though I imagine it must be quite stressful, managing all that responsibility. Not everyone is cut out for the demands of running a successful business. You're absolutely right, Mark interjected smoothly, accepting a glass of wine from a server while maintaining eye contact with James. That's why I have such profound respect for Regina. When we met, I was immediately struck by how she'd built something meaningful from the ground up. No family money, no inherited connections, just vision, determination, and an exceptional mind for strategy. Each word was chosen with surgical precision, highlighting everything James had once criticized about Regina's background and reframing it as strength rather than weakness. Mark wasn't defending her. Regina needed no defense. He was simply stating facts while making it abundantly clear that he saw value where James had seen only deficiency. Family money isn't everything, Regina added quietly, her eyes meeting James's across the table. Sometimes it just makes people lazy. Complacent. They stop appreciating what they have because they never had to fight for it. The barb landed cleanly. James had inherited his company from his father, expanded it modestly, but never built anything from nothing the way Regina had. His success was real, but it was also inevitable, born from privilege rather than forged through adversity. Well, Eleanor interjected, clearly uncomfortable with the shifting power dynamics at her carefully orchestrated dinner. Shall we eat? The chef prepared duck confit, James's favorite, as servers began placing courses before them. Regina caught James staring at her, not with the triumphant superiority he'd worn when she first entered, but with something else. Confusion, perhaps, or the dawning realization that the narrative he'd constructed where he was the prize and she was the grateful recipient of his attention had never been true. Mark leaned slightly toward Regina, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You're doing beautifully." She didn't need the reassurance, but it warmed her nonetheless. This was the difference between a partner and a possessor. Mark celebrated her strength rather than feeling threatened by it. Across the table, James picked up his wine glass with slightly more force than necessary, the crystal ringing faintly against his rings. He'd invited Regina here to remind her of her place, to parade his happiness and her supposed failure. Instead, he was sitting in his childhood home, surrounded by family money and inherited success, facing a woman who'd become everything he'd told her she couldn't be. And the night had only just begun. The duck confit arrived with all the ceremony James's family expected from a meal that cost more than most people earned in a week. But no one was paying much attention to the food. The real spectacle was unfolding across the perfectly set table, where Regina Hawking sat with the quiet confidence of someone who'd learned that power didn't require volume. James's cousin, Victoria, broke the awkward silence that had settled over the first course. "So, Regina, what exactly is it that you do? James mentioned you were trying to start some little business after the divorce." The phrasing was deliberate, designed to diminish, but Regina simply smiled, taking a delicate sip of wine before responding. "I founded Hawking Development Group. We specialize in sustainable urban renewal projects. Currently, we're working with the city on a $50 million redevelopment of the waterfront district." The number hung in the air like an uninvited guest. 50 million. Not a little business. Not something she was trying to do. A legitimate empire built from nothing but vision and relentless work. 50 million? Eleanor's fork clattered against her plate. "That's quite ambitious." "Ambition used to be considered a flaw in me," Regina said quietly, her eyes finding James across the table. "I remember being told that I should focus on being supportive rather than having ideas of my own, that my dreams were too big for someone from my background." She wasn't shouting, wasn't accusing, just stating facts with the calm precision of someone who no longer needed approval from people who'd once made her feel small. James shifted in his chair, his knuckles whitening around his wineglass. "I never said that." "Didn't you?" Regina's tone remained gentle, almost conversational. "I distinctly remember a conversation in our kitchen where you laughed at the idea of me going back to school. You said I should be grateful for the life you'd given me, instead of chasing fantasies." Mark's hand found Regina's under the table, a subtle gesture of support. But he didn't interrupt, didn't rush to defend her. He understood that this moment belonged to Regina alone. "People say things they don't mean when they're young," James countered, his voice tight. "I'm sure I was just being realistic about the challenges." "You called my family trash," Regina interrupted, her voice still calm but carrying an edge now. "Multiple times. You said I'd never amount to anything without your name attached to mine. That I was lucky you'd overlooked my inadequacies." The table had gone completely silent. Even the servers had stopped moving, frozen in place by the quiet devastation of Regina's words. James's father, Richard, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps we should discuss more pleasant topics." "I think this is pleasant," Mark said smoothly, his voice carrying no aggression, just matter-of-fact observation. "Regina is sharing her truth. That seems like exactly the kind of honesty families should engage in, don't you think?" His words were perfectly calibrated, respectful to Richard while making it clear he stood firmly in Regina's corner, not as her protector but as her equal partner. James leaned back in his chair, attempting to reclaim his earlier smugness. "You've obviously been nursing these grievances for years. I invited you here hoping we could move past all that unpleasantness, but clearly you're still bitter about how things ended." "Bitter?" Regina's laugh was soft, genuine. "James, I'm not bitter. I'm grateful. Everything you said to me, every time you made me feel worthless, every affair you flaunted, they all taught me something invaluable." "And what's that?" James's voice dripped with sarcasm, but there was something desperate underneath it now. "That your opinion of me was never the truth. It was just your insecurity dressed up as superiority." Regina set down her fork, giving James her full attention. "You needed me to stay small because my growth threatened you. But the moment I stopped believing your lies, I became unstoppable." Mark glanced at Regina with undisguised admiration, not jumping in to add his own commentary but simply bearing witness to her reclamation of power. His respect for her was evident in his silence, in the way he let her own her story, without trying to narrate it for her. James's mother interjected, her voice strained. "Regina, dear, I think you're being unnecessarily harsh. James only ever wanted the best for you." "Did he?" Regina turned to Eleanor with genuine curiosity. "Is that why he told me I embarrassed him at your fundraiser because I didn't know which fork to use? Or why he made me change my clothes 3 times before your anniversary party because nothing I owned was appropriate for your social circle?" Eleanor's face flushed, caught between defending her son and confronting uncomfortable truths she'd witnessed but never acknowledged. "This is ridiculous," James snapped, his composure finally cracking. "I gave you everything. A home, security, access to a world you never would have known without me." "You gave me a cage," Regina said quietly, each word landing with precision. "And you convinced me it was a palace. But Mark showed me the difference." She turned to look at Mark, her expression softening. "He celebrates my success instead of resenting it. He encourages my ambitions instead of mocking them. He treats my family with respect instead of condescension. That's the difference between a man who loves you and a man who collects you." Mark's eyes held warmth and pride, but he still didn't speak. This wasn't about him proving anything to James. This was about Regina finally saying everything she'd swallowed during 5 years of marriage. James pushed back from the table abruptly, his chair scraping against hardwood. "I don't have to sit here and listen to this character assassination. You're rewriting history to make yourself feel better about being alone for 3 years. But she wasn't alone." Mark finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "She built a company, developed relationships with people who valued her, created a life so full that by the time we met, she didn't need anyone, she chose me. That's the difference, James. You required Regina to need you. I'm honored that she wants me." The distinction was devastating in its simplicity. James stood frozen, caught between sitting back down in defeat or storming out in rage. His carefully orchestrated evening had completely unraveled. He'd invited Regina to parade his superiority, to remind her of her place, to cement his narrative that leaving her had been the right choice. Instead, he was watching her shine in front of everyone who mattered to him, while he looked smaller with every passing moment. Regina took a sip of water, her hand perfectly steady. "Thank you for the invitation, James. I needed this closure more than I realized." The word closure was the final blow, suggesting this evening meant something to her, but not what he'd intended. James remained standing, his knuckles white where they gripped the back of his chair, his carefully constructed composure crumbling with each passing second. The silence in the dining room was suffocating. Even the servers had retreated to the kitchen, sensing that what was unfolding wasn't meant for outside witnesses. This was family business now, though Regina had stopped being family the day James signed the divorce papers with a smile on his face. "You know what I find fascinating?" James' voice cut through the quiet, sharp and bitter. His facade of civility was gone, replaced by something uglier, more desperate. "You sit here acting like you've won some great victory, but let's be honest about what you really are, Regina." Mark started to speak, but Regina placed a gentle hand on his arm, stopping him. This moment belonged to her. She'd been preparing for it, consciously or not, for 3 years. "Please," Regina said calmly. "Continue." James leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with the cruelty she remembered too well. "You came from nothing. Your father was a mechanic. Your mother cleaned houses, including houses like this one. You went to community college because that's all you could afford, and you barely graduated with a degree nobody respects." He gestured around the opulent dining room. "This world? You never belonged here. You were playing dress-up in a life that was never meant for you." The words were designed to wound, to strip away everything Regina had built, and reduce her back to the insecure young woman who'd once believed his assessments were truth rather than tactics. Eleanor gasped, softly. "James, that's enough." "No, Mother, it's not enough." James was spiraling now, his need to reassert dominance overriding his usual calculated control. "She walks in here with her rented dress and borrowed confidence, pretending she's somehow my equal, but we all know the truth. Without me, without my name, she'd still be serving drinks at charity galas instead of attending them. Regina took a slow breath, feeling Mark's steady presence beside her like an anchor. But she didn't need him to save her. She'd already saved herself. That was the whole point. "You're absolutely right," Regina said quietly, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "About most of it anyway." James blinked, clearly expecting rage or tears, not agreement. "My father was a mechanic," Regina continued, her tone conversational, almost reflective. "One of the best in the city. He could diagnose an engine problem by sound alone. And he taught me that honest work has its own dignity. My mother did clean houses, including several in this neighborhood. She taught me that there's no shame in hard work, only in looking down on those who do it." She paused, letting the subtle rebuke land before continuing. "You're right that I went to community college. I worked 40 hours a week to pay for it because no one was going to hand me an education. And yes, my degree isn't from Harvard like yours. But I earned every credit without Daddy's money or legacy admissions." James's face was reddening, but Regina wasn't finished. "But here's where you're wrong, James." Her voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath now. "You didn't give me this world. You gave me a cage and convinced me it was a palace. You made me believe I should be grateful for crumbs when I deserved the whole feast. And your greatest gift to me wasn't your name or your connections or access to rooms like this one." She stood slowly, her movements deliberate and graceful, matching his height with her presence if not her physical stature. "Your greatest gift was showing me exactly what I didn't want to become. Every cruel word, every affair, every time you made me feel worthless, you were teaching me who I never wanted to be." "That's easy to say now," James spat, his composure completely shattered. "Now that you've got another wealthy man to latch onto." "I built my company before I met Mark," Regina interrupted, her voice sharp for the first time. "Every single location, every employee, every contract. I did that while you were busy congratulating yourself on escaping me. I did it with the name you tried to make me ashamed of hawking." "Not Lewis. Me." Mark finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that made everyone listen. "I think you misunderstand the situation, James. Regina doesn't need me. She doesn't need my money, or my connections, or my last name. She chose to be with me because we're partners, not because I'm a meal ticket." He stood, moving to stand beside Regina, a united front. "The difference between you and me isn't our bank accounts or our pedigrees. It's that I recognize Regina's value. I don't tolerate her success, I celebrate it. I don't feel threatened when she outperforms me, I feel proud. That's what partnership looks like." James's jaw worked silently, searching for a comeback that wouldn't come. "You wanted me to walk in here feeling less than," Regina said, her voice softening but losing none of its power. "You wanted to parade your success and my supposed failures. You wanted to remind me that I'd lost you, as if that was the worst thing that could happen to me." She shook her head slowly, almost with pity. "But James, losing you was the best thing that ever happened to me. You broke me down so thoroughly that I had no choice but to rebuild from scratch. And when I did, I built something you could never touch, or diminish, or take credit for. I built myself." The words hung in the air like a benediction and a eulogy all at once. Eleanor was quietly crying into her napkin. Victoria stared at her plate, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Richard cleared his throat repeatedly, but said nothing. The whole carefully orchestrated evening had imploded, leaving only raw truth in its wake. "Every time you told me I wasn't good enough, you were really saying you were terrified I might realize I was," Regina continued, her voice gentle now, almost compassionate. "Every time you cheated, you were confirming that you were exactly as shallow as I feared. Every time you tried to make me smaller, you were revealing how small you felt inside." James sank back into his chair, the fight draining out of him. He looked suddenly older, diminished not by Regina's words, but by the truth they carried. "I forgive you," Regina said, and the words clearly shocked everyone, including James himself. "Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace. I forgive you for the years you stole, for the confidence you shattered, for making me believe your limitations were mine." She picked up her clutch, Mark already moving to pull out her chair. Thank you for the dinner, Eleanor. It was exactly what I needed. As they moved toward the door, James finally found his voice. Regina, wait. She paused, turning back one final time. You didn't break me, James. You only showed me what I was capable of surviving, and that made me unstoppable. The words echoed in the stunning silence as Regina and Mark walked out of the dining room, leaving James Lewis sitting in his family's mansion, surrounded by wealth and emptiness, finally understanding the cost of everything he'd lost. The foyer of the Lewis mansion felt different now, smaller somehow, as if the building itself had contracted under the weight of truth spoken aloud. Regina paused at the marble-topped console table where she'd left countless coats during her years as James's wife, each visit an exercise in feeling inadequate. Now, as Mark helped her with her wrap, she caught her reflection in the gilded mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Not because she looked different, but because she finally saw herself clearly. Behind them, the dining room had erupted into hushed, urgent conversations. Regina could hear Eleanor's voice rising in distress, Victoria trying to comfort her, Richard demanding to know what had just happened, but beneath it all, there was silence from James. Regina. His voice cut through the chaos, rough and desperate in a way she'd never heard before. She turned slowly, finding him standing in the dining room doorway, his tall frame somehow diminished. The arrogant billionaire who'd orchestrated this evening to parade his superiority had vanished, replaced by a man who suddenly understood exactly what he'd lost. Please just, James stopped, his hands flexing at his sides as if reaching for words that wouldn't come. Give me a moment, 5 minutes, that's all I'm asking. Mark's hand found the small of Regina's back, a silent question. It was her choice. It had always been her choice, even when she'd felt powerless in this house. 5 minutes, Regina agreed. Not because James deserved them, but because she needed this final moment of closure. They moved to James's study, the room where he'd conducted business deals and affairs with equal efficiency. Mark stayed in the hallway, close enough to intervene if needed but giving Regina space to finish what she'd started. James closed the door, then immediately opened it again, as if realizing that a closed door might feel threatening to her. The gesture was small but significant, perhaps the first time he'd considered her comfort over his control. I didn't bring you here to hurt you, James said, the words tumbling out quickly. I know that's what it looked like. But that wasn't. He stopped, running his hands through his hair. That's a lie. I did want to hurt you. I wanted to see you small again. Regina remained silent, allowing him space to continue. When you left, when I made you leave, I told myself I'd won, James continued, his voice cracking slightly, that I'd escaped before you could drag me down, that I'd traded up. But tonight, watching you walk in with him, seeing what you've become, he shook his head. I realized I didn't win anything. I threw away the only real thing I ever had. James, Regina started, but he held up a hand. No, please. Let me finish because I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to say this again. He took a shaky breath. You were right. About all of it. I needed you to stay small because your potential terrified me. Every time you suggested going back to school or starting a business, I heard a voice in my head saying you'd outgrow me, that you'd realize you were better off without me. The admission hung between them, years of cruelty distilled into its bitter truth. So I tried to keep you trapped. James continued, his eyes finally meeting hers. I criticized everything about you, your family, your education, your dreams. I cheated because I wanted you to feel as worthless as I was afraid I'd become if you ever saw yourself clearly. And when you still wouldn't break, when you kept loving me despite everything, I couldn't stand it. So I left. Regina felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. James had been operating from fear and insecurity, lashing out at her to avoid confronting his own inadequacies. You didn't break me, James, Regina said quietly, her voice steady and sure. You only gave me the strength to build something better. Every cruel word taught me resilience. Every affair taught me my worth. Every time you tried to diminish me, you were actually showing me how much power I had, power that terrified you so much you had to try to destroy it. James's face crumpled. Years of carefully constructed arrogance, collapsing under the weight of recognition. The woman who walked out of our marriage 3 years ago was broken, Regina continued, taking a step closer. She believed every lie you told her. She thought she was lucky to be chosen by you. She measured her worth by your approval. She paused, making sure he was listening. But that woman died, James. She had to die so I could be born. I'm sorry. James whispered, the words inadequate but genuine. God, Regina, I'm so sorry. I know you are, Regina said, surprised to find she meant it. And I forgive you. Not because you've earned it, but because carrying anger toward you was like drinking poison and expecting you to die. I deserve peace more than you deserve punishment. She moved toward the door, then paused, turning back one last time. You asked me here tonight to prove you'd won, to show me everything I'd lost by not being good enough for you. But James, I need you to understand something. He looked up at her, eyes red-rimmed, waiting. You didn't lose me because I wasn't good enough, Regina said, her voice gentle but firm. You lost me because you weren't. You lost me because real love requires courage, the courage to celebrate someone else's growth even when it makes you feel small, the courage to choose partnership over domination. You didn't have that courage then. She reached for the door handle, her hand steady. I hope someday you find it. Not for my sake. I don't need anything from you anymore. But for yours, because living the way you've been living isn't really living at all. It's just existing in a beautiful cage you've built from other people's approval. Regina, James's voice stopped her one last time. He's good to you, Mark? A genuine smile crossed Regina's face, the kind that came from deep contentment rather than performance. He's my equal. He celebrates my success instead of resenting it. He encourages my growth instead of fearing it. He chose me, and I chose him back. That's the difference. She opened the door to find Mark waiting exactly where she'd left him, patient and present. He took one look at her face and offered his arm, understanding without words that this chapter was finally closed. As they walked toward the front entrance, Regina heard footsteps behind them. The family had gathered Eleanor, Richard, Victoria, and others drawn by the sound of voices, by the sense that something fundamental had shifted in the carefully ordered universe of the Lewis household. They stood in the foyer watching as Regina and Mark prepared to leave, their expressions a mixture of shock, admiration, and something that might have been shame. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice trembling. Regina, I want you to know I should have said something. All those times he belittled you. I should have defended you. I'm sorry. Regina studied the older woman, seeing genuine remorse in her eyes. Thank you for saying that, Eleanor. It means more than you know. The front door opened, October air rushing in with the promise of freedom. Mark and Regina stepped through together, descending the marble steps hand in hand. Behind them, the mansion stood as it always had, magnificent and imposing and hollow. Inside, James Lewis remained, finally understanding that true power had nothing to do with wealth or status or control. It had everything to do with becoming someone worthy of being chosen. The October night embraced Regina and Mark as they descended the mansion steps, cool air washing over them like a baptism into new beginnings. Regina paused at the bottom, turning back to look at the illuminated windows of the Lewis estate. Inside, she could see shadows moving. The family likely gathered around James, processing what had just transpired. But for the first time in years, their opinions held no weight over her. Are you all right? Mark asked softly, his hand warm in hers. Regina took a deep breath, tasting freedom in the crisp autumn air. I'm more than all right. I'm finally free. They walked to Mark's car in silence, but it wasn't the heavy silence of tension or regret. It was the peaceful quiet that came after a storm, when the world felt washed clean and new possibilities stretched endlessly ahead. Mark opened her door, but before she could slide in, Regina turned to face him, her hands finding his lapels, pulling him close. Thank you, she whispered, for being exactly who you are, for not trying to fight my battles or speak over me, for just being there. He cupped her face gently, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones. That's what partnership looks like, Regina. I don't need to rescue you. You've already saved yourself. I just get the privilege of standing beside you while you shine." The kiss they shared was tender and unhurried, filled with promise rather than possession. When they pulled apart, Regina was smiling genuinely, deeply happy in a way she hadn't been in years. As Mark navigated the tree-lined streets away from the Lewis estate, Regina watched the mansion shrink in the side mirror until it disappeared entirely. She thought about the woman who'd lived there once, who'd walked those halls trying to make herself smaller, quieter, less ambitious to fit into someone else's idea of who she should be. "I used to dream about this," Regina said, breaking the comfortable silence. "About confronting James, telling him everything I'd been too afraid to say. But in my dreams, I always imagined myself angry, shouting, making him feel as small as he'd made me feel. But that's not how it happened," Mark observed, his voice warm with pride. "No." Regina shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips. "Because somewhere along the way, I stopped needing him to hurt the way I'd hurt. I just needed him to understand that his cruelty didn't define me, it only defined him." Mark reached across the console, lacing his fingers through hers. "That's growth, love. That's healing. Revenge would have been easy. But you chose something harder, you chose peace." They drove through the city, past neighborhoods that grew progressively more familiar, more home. When they pulled up to Regina's apartment building, the one she'd chosen and furnished herself, every piece a celebration of her taste, rather than someone else's approval, she felt a surge of gratitude for the journey that had brought her here. Inside her apartment, Regina kicked off her heels and moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. The lights sparkled like earthbound stars, each one representing someone's dream, someone's struggle, someone's triumph. Mark came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" "Everything," Regina admitted. "The woman I was, the woman I am now. How impossible this moment would have seemed 3 years ago when I was crying on the bathroom floor, convinced I'd never survive losing him." "But you did more than survive," Mark murmured against her hair. "You thrived. You built something extraordinary, not just your business, but yourself." Regina turned in his arms, studying his face in the soft light filtering through the windows. This man who chose her every day, who celebrated her success, who understood that love wasn't about possession but partnership. "I love you," she said. The word simple, but carrying the weight of everything she'd learned about love, that it should build you up rather than tear you down, that it should encourage your growth rather than fear it, that it should feel like coming home rather than walking on eggshells. "I love you too," Mark replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "And I can't wait to see what you build next. What we build next, together." The next morning, Regina woke to sunshine streaming through her windows and the smell of coffee brewing in her kitchen. She found Mark at her breakfast bar, his laptop open, already working through emails. He looked up when she entered, his face lighting up with a smile that still made her heart skip. "Good morning, beautiful. Coffee's ready." As Regina poured herself a cup, her phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Eleanor Lewis. "Thank you for your grace last night. You deserved better than what my son gave you. I hope you found the happiness you always deserved." Regina stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back simply, "I have. Thank you." She deleted the thread afterward, not out of anger, but out of choice. The Lewis family was no longer a chapter she needed to revisit. That book was closed, its lessons learned and integrated into the story she was still writing. "Work calls already?" Mark asked, nodding at her phone. "Just closing old chapters." Regina smiled, setting the phone aside. "I have a meeting with the city council this afternoon about the waterfront project. Want to help me rehearse my presentation?" "I thought you'd never ask." Mark's grin was infectious. "Though honestly, watching you command a room is one of my favorite activities." Across town, in a mansion that suddenly felt too large and too empty, James Lewis sat in his study, the room still carrying the faint scent of Regina's perfume from the night before. He'd spent the hours since she left replaying every moment of their confrontation, every word she'd spoken with such devastating calm. His family had tried to comfort him, to rationalize his behavior, but their words felt hollow. For the first time in years, James saw himself clearly not as the successful man who'd had the good sense to leave a woman beneath him, but as the insecure boy who'd torn down someone extraordinary because her light made him feel dim. His phone sat on the desk. Regina's number still in his contacts. He picked it up, thumb hovering over her name, then set it down again. There was nothing left to say. She'd said it all for him last night, had shown him exactly who he was and what he'd lost. All he could do now was decide who he wanted to become. Regina stood at her office window later that afternoon, looking out over the city she'd conquered one contract at a time. Sophia knocked on her office door, holding a stack of files. The council meeting documents are ready. And Regina, you look different today. Happy. I am happy, Regina confirmed, turning to face her assistant with a genuine smile. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do, with exactly the right people in my corner. As Sophia left, Regina returned to her window, watching the city pulse with life and possibility. Somewhere out there, James was grappling with the consequences of his choices. Somewhere out there, other women were finding the courage to leave relationships that diminished them. Somewhere out there, the future was waiting to be built. And Regina Hawking was ready, not because she'd defeated her ex-husband at his own game, but because she'd stopped playing games altogether. She'd chosen authenticity over approval, growth over comfort, partnership over possession. The best revenge, she'd learned, wasn't making someone pay for hurting you. It was building a life so beautiful, so authentic, so full that their absence became irrelevant. And as Regina gathered her files for the city council meeting, her phone lighting up with an encouraging text from Mark, she knew with absolute certainty. The best was yet to come. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.